You are listening to the serialized audiobook podcast for Blood of the Stars, an epic fantasy novel written by Karyne Norton, read by Paeter Frandsen and Karyne Norton. If you can't wait to listen to the whole audiobook, or if you want a signed physical copy, go to karynnorton.com/shop to get the lowest cost by buying direct. You can also find the audiobook on Audible, Barnes & Noble, and other standard retailers. Please enjoy the next installment of Blood of the Stars by Karyne Norton.
Chapter 66. The next morning, Karyne asked for a family dinner, surprising Enla into saying yes. They ate in their parents' quarters, his mother even paler than the last time he'd seen her. He stayed on his best behavior, hoping it would deter Enla from sifting his future to discover his plans. Once he left, she'd be sure to sift through all the possibilities, and Karyne couldn't help wondering what she'd find. For now, Enla beamed when he bent to pull out his mother's chair and guide her back to her bed. It was an odd role reversal to tuck his parents in, but Karyne had more memories of nannies and nursemaids tucking him in anyway. Still, Enla's brow knitted as they shut their parents' door and headed back to the main hall. Her anxiety made his plans all the easier, though the 4 guards following him might make things harder for Larkos. "Remember when we were young, and we sat out on the veranda to count the stars?" he asked. Enla laughed softly. "You mean when you swore there were exactly 52? I counted them dozens of times and always got the same number. How was that not enough for you?" He tucked her hand in his elbow and steered her through the corridors, aiming for the first floor and its excessively large entryway. He soaked in every stone and painting they passed, wondering when he'd see these halls again. For all the times he'd despised the way these walls held him in, he couldn't imagine never being welcome here again. "How could you possibly keep track with the way they dance?" she asked. "There's a pattern to their dance." Her look held disbelief, but she tightened her hold on his arm, more than willing to let him lead her out to the veranda, where they let propriety drop enough to kick off their shoes and drape themselves on the chaise lounges to face the sky. They counted the stars like they had in the past, Karyne coming up with 52 every single time, but his eyes were more intent on the moon's path across the sky and the guard's determined presence at the stairs leading to the lengthy drive. They would see Larkos from a long way off. "Do you think it's right that Mother and Father gave Mavis authority over the Eastern Province?" Karyne asked. "She was a power-hungry priestess. Now she's a driven queen. Who's to say she'll stop there? It doesn't matter what I think. It's been done. You can undo it." She sighed, but didn't take his bait. Larkos would come, even if she was still here. Karyne meant to drive her away instead of involving her in his escape, but he was selfish enough to want just a few more minutes with her that were unmarred by their disagreements. "Things were easier when we were children," he mused. "Perhaps they'll get easier again." Her vague words reminded him of Aura, which was equal parts disturbing and reassuring. When Enla scratched at the scar on her palm, his gut tightened. "How are things with Croft? I haven't seen him much since I returned." "Well enough." "Sounds about as well as things are going for Lenda and me." He knew it was the way of an arranged bond, but he still didn't like it. If he and Enla had been able to choose their bondmates like Larkos and Kalia had, would their bonds be stronger? For once, she didn't scold him or encourage him to lean into his bond with Lenda. Did she still want him to break it? Or had the time for that unclear strategy passed? "You're right." Enla sat up, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders as if the warm summer's night had turned cool. "Things were easier when we were young." He rolled off his chaise to sit next to her, wrapping an arm around her shoulder so she could lean into him. "I can still give Riverin a beating if you'd like." She elbowed him hard before fully settling against him. Why do you continue hating him if I've moved on? It was on the tip of his tongue to say he didn't hate Riverin, not anymore, but it felt wrong to admit that possibility to Enla, who had taken the brunt of Riverin's misconduct, when Karyne hadn't quite been able to admit it even to himself. Because you're a better person than me, he said. That's the answer to a lot of your questions about the things I do. She snorted, and he grinned. That was the Enla he remembered. He closed his eyes, inhaling the flowery perfume she liked to wear. However long he was forced to stay away, he wanted to remember her like this, even if he was more likely to be stuck with a final image of her snarling and livid. We can't undo the past, Enla said. Her words triggered Karyne's own shame. The ways he'd failed Daisy as a child, the ways he was probably still failing her as he bumbled through his efforts to protect her. Our only choice is to be vigilant about stepping forward into the future. Karyne frowned. Is that why you don't look at Croft the way you once looked at Riverin? Are you afraid to let yourself love someone who could hurt you? It's not right that Riverin spoiled that for you. You don't look at Lenda at all. Enla's quick retort surprised Karyne. What spoiled that for you? He opened his mouth to say it was Lenda herself who had spoiled it, but he realized that wasn't true. In many ways, Daisy had, or the memory of her had. His focus and drive to right his wrongs had always held higher priority. And now that he'd met Daisy as a woman instead of a child, the space she'd once held in his heart felt too small, too simple. Enla leaned back, studying his face, which likely gave away his confusion. A lot of things in life have been spoiled, but not because of Riverin, she whispered. You can't always believe the lies mother and father are forced to tell for the sake of the throne. Something cold slithered through Karyne's gut. Lies? About Riverin? Her words shouldn't surprise him. Lying about the events in Islara wasn't the first time they'd made such a compromise. But for some reason, he'd never connected that terrible possibility to Riverin. He twisted away from Enla so he could face her, wrapping his hands around her upper arms. What lies were they forced to tell? Enla winced, and Karyne released her arms, afraid he'd squeezed with too much force, but her pained expression remained. Or maybe the better question is, what truth did they cover up with their lies? His voice shook, the words coming out stilted. Enla hushed him, yanking him to the stairway, past the guards and down the path. The guards made to follow, but she waved them away. Karyne knew he should be thrilled. This could work in his favor. But he was too distracted by Enla's secrecy and the clear magnitude of what she had to share. She stopped near the first set of overarching oak trees, the moon at its zenith and barely filtering through the branches to highlight her raised chin, her eyes like flint. Riverin didn't break our bond. Mother and father did. Karyne took a step back, his head spinning, heart pounding. Impossible. The scandal would never be worth it. It would if he wasn't worthy of the throne. Enla said the words with a hint of disgust. He never had an awakening. He never received a starlock. It didn't matter that his starblood concentration was higher than any other because he wasn't chosen by the sun. Karyne's mind raced through his memories, all the times he and Riverin had played with their adolescent magic. Riverin never could do much, but it was the same for most children on the cusp of adulthood. They all had to wait for their awakening, for the stars to gift them with a lock of hair to enhance their magic. It was rare for nobility to not be chosen with their high starblood concentration, impossible for a bond of the royal family, or so he'd thought. Karyne turned from Enla, grasping the tree for support, sickened by this revelation, by the fact that he'd allowed the deception to change the way he viewed his friend. He and I were never meant to be, Enla's lip wavered. The sun didn't choose him. He wasn't worthy of the throne. Mother and father didn't want to worry everyone with the possibility that their sons and daughters also wouldn't be chosen, that the son might be choosing fewer progenies. Larkos's prediction that magic was being bred out of the people might not be so far off. It doesn't matter. Enla pulled her wrap tighter around her shoulders. The bond was still broken. The real reason doesn't change anything. It changes everything, Karyne whispered. His friend had been faithful. Even worse, Riverin had tried telling Karyne, but Karyne had refused to listen. A flicker of movement down the path caught his eye. Larkos. He turned back to his sister, frowning down at her, grateful to at least see a hint of remorse on her face, even as he blocked her view of the path. Maybe he wasn't worthy of this throne. He waved a hand toward their home. I don't know. I don't even care. But he was always worthy of your love. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, her focus too intent on the disappointment oozing from his every pore to notice the clip-clop of the hooves getting closer. She scratched at the scar on her hand, the one nearly hidden by her new bond. Daisy's words about scars came back to Karyne, the idea that some scars were best left as reminders to show weakness and help them grow stronger. Was that why Enla kept her scar? To remind her that Riverin had been a weakness? Or to remind herself that she had been too weak to fight for the man she'd loved? Sometimes in order to truly love someone, Enla hissed, you have to let them go. He shook his head, even though he knew that was what he was doing with her now, in this very moment. It wasn't the same. It couldn't be. I want to be alone, he said, even if it's just for a few moments. Have the guards collect me after you're in bed. Enla pursed her lips, her eyes flashing with indignation. Karyne tried channeling the moment they'd had on the veranda, the scent of her perfume, the comfortable safety and warmth of family, but for once his magic failed him, his mind too focused on the here and now. Life isn't a fairy tale, she said. Real happy endings come with a price. She pushed past him, her hair and dress flouncing out to hit him with one last puff of lilac before she rounded the trees and out of sight. If the price is too high, he whispered, there's no happy ending at all, for anyone. It wasn't possible she heard him, but even if she had, she wouldn't have listened. Her dedication to the throne was probably admirable, but it also scared Karyne. He shook his head, turning to the approaching wagon. He raced to meet Larkos before the horses could come any closer. The older man sat up on the bench, his hooded cloak concealing his telltale tattoos and earring, but Thalahan leaned out from the back of the wagon, grinning ear to ear. Arms reached out to haul Karyne up before Larkos could turn around, but Karyne didn't have time to examine whom they belonged to. While empty kegs were tossed over the wagon's edge, a paper and pen were shoved under Karyne's nose. He signed without question, pressing his signet ring into the soft wax. Thalahan rolled up the note, and the other men shoved Karyne into a compartment beneath the bench, hidden by hay, momentarily making Karyne question his own sanity. The space felt large enough for only one, and he folded his limbs together to fit, but as the door shut and he scooted in farther, he bumped against something soft and warm. I told them to leave me back at star speed. Riverin's voice came through the darkness, making tears prick at the back of Karyne's eyes. He wished he could see his old friend, but it was enough to know he was there. He'd always been there if Karyne had been willing to look. They couldn't decide if I would attract negative attention or give them clout to get in the grounds, Riverin said. For some reason, that meant I got stuck riding in here with you. Karyne wanted to tell Riverin he wouldn't want it any other way, but his throat grew too raw to speak. He found Riverin's shoulder and clapped a hand on it. Did you see Marnock up in the wagon? Riverin asked. Karyne shook his head, then barked out a no when he remembered Riverin was as blind in the darkness as he was. He checked all the taverns and merchants. Not a single soul recognized him.
He's asked permission to sail with us. At first, Larkos said no, but then he figured even if you don't trust him, the fact that Marnock knows where we're going is dangerous. He's leaving it up to you to decide if he comes as a sailor or as cargo."
Garen's laugh came out harsh as he choked back the knot clogging his throat. He dragged in a breath, fighting the clash of the pain over Enla's lies with the sudden rush of camaraderie with a friend he'd unfairly abandoned.
"You all right?"
Riverin asked. Garen squeezed his friend's shoulder tighter. Even though it was his opposite spoke, sending Riverin the memories suddenly felt easier than trying to explain. They came through in reverse order: the heat of Enla's admission, the stubborn hatred Garen had carried for the last 2 years, the pain Garen had shared with Enla when he'd returned to address her broken bond, the last moments Riverin and Garen had shared as friends before Garen had left for school. Dozens of childhood memories of running, laughing, fighting, playing, solidifying the foundation Garen and Riverin's friendship had been built on. The memories cut off as Garen's hand slipped with the jostle of the wagon. A long pause settled between them before Riverin wrenched him in for a hug that was almost too fierce.
"It was she who betrayed you,"
Garen whispered.
"I'm sorry, brother. I doubt you have the full story."
Riverin let Garen go, his voice breaking. Suddenly the darkness felt like a blessing.
"It's never completely one person's fault. Well, now I'm ready to listen."
A hand rapped on the wood of their compartment.
"Shut up, lovebirds. We're almost at the gate."
Chapter 67. The stop at the gate took far longer than Garen would have liked, but after a fair amount of arguing, Larkos showed the guards Garen's seal of approval and convinced them they'd already delivered the ale Prince Garen had ordered to a back door per his instructions. It sounded like something Garen might have done in his recent state. A knock came from above, signaling they could talk again, but by now Riverin and Garen had grown uncomfortably quiet. Dozens of questions ran through Garen's head, questions about Riverin's wife and baby, why his friend had kept quiet about the truth, how the bond had been broken if it wasn't for Riverin's infidelity. As far as Garen knew, the only way besides death or unfaithfulness was to cut the bond out. Had his parents forced that on Riverin? Or had they forced the wife on Riverin? But all of those questions seemed too personal after the gap in their friendship the last 2 years.
"Why did she tell you?"
Riverin asked. Garen's muscles loosened with the question, with the permission to talk again.
"I'm not sure.
Maybe she'd rather I hate her than you? It's how it felt in the moment. I'm not sure I ever understand my sister's motivations." Riverin's low laugh sounded forced.
"Well, I was sworn to secrecy. Telling you would have been treason."
Garen frowned. Treason against my parents? Or Enla?
"More likely treason against you,"
Riverin sighed.
"They knew you wouldn't approve of the choice, even if I accepted it. I understood the problem. Enla is next in line to the throne. What if her children didn't become progenies? What would that mean for the future of LNS?
Irritation flooded through Garen, not just with his sister, but with himself, because a small part of him did understand the concern. He'd been raised to believe the people needed guidance from someone with greater access to the sun's power. How had he ever thought something like that was more important than individuals? More important than friendships and people like Riverin? It was bad enough that Enla had gone on thinking it, that Riverin had just accepted it.
"She cried for weeks over you."
For once, Garen's accusations held confusion instead of heat. Had it all been for show? Riverin cleared his throat.
"Just because we agreed it needed to be done doesn't mean it didn't hurt."
The other man's emotions were too close to the surface, the memories rising whether Garen meant to access them or not. Riverin's anguish, the pain searing through his palm like lightning straight to his heart, a sense of being utterly alone, cut off from half of his own self. It mirrored Enla's pain, drawing out Garen's own memories of his failed attempts to remove her memory, to end her suffering. Riveren's memories kept flowing through Garen like a dam had been released. Riveren hiding in Garen's mangrove tree for days, then a stranger's home with a woman sobbing, night after night of silent meals while the woman's belly grew, a tentative smile, the blossom of a friendship built on mutual need, a baby shoved in Riveren's arms, a sense of responsibility, a commitment to protect. The visions faded in Riveren's mind, the sense of time slowing and returning to the present rumble of the wagon as unsettling as always.
The child isn't yours.
He'd meant it to be a question, but Riveren had already answered it with his memories.
Her husband died at sea.
But now you're her husband, and the child is your son?
It's the story we've been asked to tell.
Riveren hesitated like the words stuck in his mouth. A lie told so much and for so long it was hard for him to stop.
I provide for her and the child. I will continue to do so until she can provide for herself, or until she finds someone else. But we never wed. She's always known I still love Enla.
Garen squeezed his eyes shut even though the blackness was already absolute. Rage tore through him, the need to let it out in some capacity overwhelming in the tiny hidden chamber. The horses continued their slow plod, unaware that it grated on Garen's nerves.
So you don't even have a bond mark?
How had he not noticed that in all their time together? But the memories he'd seen made it clear. There was no bond in effect.
Maybe it can be undone. If Enla knew you still love her,
she knows. Riveren's quiet words silenced Garen.
She was the future queen before she was ever mine.
Garen shook his head in disbelief.
What happened to my sister?
A strangled laugh escaped from Riveren.
Nothing. She has remained constant all her years. It's you who's changed. And you can thank her for that. She saw the way her parents were manipulating both of you into becoming a new generation of oppressive rulers. She knew it would break you, so she freed you.
His words echoed everything Enla had said, hardening them to truth in Garen's mind.
But she imprisoned herself. She's become just like them. She would still sacrifice everything for you,
Riveren said. It was probably an attempt to reassure Garen, but it fell short. She already had sacrificed everything for him. Is this what the sprites had meant?
Despite our bond,
Riveren continued,
I always knew she loved you more. I just assumed she could always love us both, a brother and a bondmate. That's not something anyone should have to choose between.
Murmurs came from above, and the horses slowed to a stop.
I'm sorry.
Garen's words felt too small, too rushed. It would take a lifetime to make this up to Riveren, and even then it wouldn't be enough.
You only need to be sorry if you waste what she's given you.
The door to their compartment opened, the moonlight bright enough to make them squint. Garen found Riveren's eyes before his gaze settled on the X. Kendallen's admission about what she'd sifted in Riveren's soul came back to him.
And was that because you stole bread for your family?
Riveren shrugged and looked away.
That's what the magistrate said. It's what Enla told him to say. There were days I had to steal bread because few people wanted me working for them. You two gonna stay in there all night?
Breve asked, yanking on Garen's elbow.
I thought we were in a rush.
Garen ignored the young sailor, too intent on the parts of Riveren's story that didn't line up.
But that's not why you were caught?
Riveren shook his head.
No. The man who sold me that book you wanted so badly turned me in for black market trade, claimed the book had been stolen from him before it was sold to me, that it was a Vendaran artifact meant to be revered in the Sun Gazers.
If they believed him, you should have been hanged. Garen's mind raced as his guilt rose. Riverin had been in danger because of him.
Which is why Enla told the magistrate to mark me as a traitor instead. Keeping me one step away from a hanging was the only way she could protect me.
Garen pursed his lips to hold in his bitter response. Riverin shrugged.
The only thing I don't understand is why Kendallin kept that part of the story to herself.
Larkos's frown replaced Breeve's eager face.
I didn't commit treason just to get caught with you two crying in each other's arms on the docks.
He pulled on Garen's arm with far more force than Breeve.
Move it, now!
They rushed through the near-empty docks, the hour too late even for revelers but too early for fishermen. As Starspeed came into view, a new sense of urgency and energy rushed through Garen. He couldn't erase all that had happened in the past, not for Daisy and not for Riverin, not even for Enla or himself. But this was the best way he knew how to move forward. Marnock boarded the boat with them, hesitating briefly when he took in the rigging. He slid a hand over the rope, glancing back at Garen with an almost fearful confusion. When the older man climbed the mainmast with the skill of an experienced sailor, Garen knew yet another fractured memory plagued Marnock. Another soul on board whom Garen could only hope to help by moving forward. When he passed Thalahan, he paused, his mind tuning in to another memory. Aren't you supposed to be getting married in less than a moon? For summer solstice? Thalahan gave him a sheepish shrug. We pushed it back. Maybe harvest day or winter solstice. I promised her we'd wed without threat of war. He winced. I may also have promised that you'd attend with a princely gift. Garen laughed. You realize I no longer have access to the royal coffers? Thalahan grinned. You'll find a way. By the time the sun peeked over the horizon, Gullet had joined them, but they were far enough out of harbor that no one else would recognize them. Still, Garen scanned the waters uneasily. The landmarks of Eleness and the northwest coastline of Vendaris were interrupted by 3 unfamiliar specks. Are we being followed? Garen reached for the spyglass to identify the ships behind them.
Ah, that,
Larkos muttered, pulling the spyglass from Garen's hand.
I might have left that part out.
Garen raised his eyebrows and crossed his arms.
Riverin found 20 of your men,
the old man said with a shrug, then scanned the ship, drawing Garen's attention to the fact that there were far more than 20 men aboard.
Seems the area he's been living in the past couple of years is full of recreants, real ones, not the ones who give me half-truths to test my loyalty after sailing with the likes of you.
Garen frowned, taking in the strangers aboard his ship. A couple even had matching tattoos on their foreheads, labeling them as traitors like Riverin. This should have been cleared with me. Starspeed is—
Quit your yapping.
Larkos smacked Garen on the back, hard enough to keep him from arguing again.
You're as bad as Gullet. They'll fight for you, and that's what matters. Even if most of the crew on the other 3 ships are pirates.
He laughed harder, like he'd been waiting to get this one last dig in. Sailing the northern sea against the king's commands, in league with pirates. Well, Garen supposed he'd known it would be near impossible to return to LNS. This sealed it. He leaned back over the edge of the boat, taking in the spray of seawater as his homeland disappeared in the morning mist. I suppose Kalia will never forgive me for stealing you away so soon again.
She might not forgive me, Larkos said, but you've got her wrapped around your little finger. She sent cookies and pastries for you, even though she barely gave me a farewell kiss.
He rubbed at his bond mark, the smile on his face suggesting his words were an exaggeration. What now? Garen asked.
Now we go in search of real freedom.
Freedom, Garen scoffed. It had once sounded unattainable because of his forced ties to LNS, But now it seemed impossible because he would never be free to return. He rubbed at his own bond mark. Enla had wanted him to remove it. Did it even matter at this point? As a traitor, he wouldn't be welcomed home, but they wouldn't bother chasing him down.
Freedom likely tastes different to every man,
Larkos mused. The rising sun lit up the tattoos covering his bald head.
Could be preference, like how Breve enjoys his meat burned to a crisp.
They both watched the young sailor fumbling with a pack of spices. He doesn't like it that way. He's just a terrible cook.
Aye,
Larkos chuckled.
Maybe it depends on how hungry a man is when he sits down for a meal. For some of these men, the freedom they're starving for has the metallic bite of gold.
Blood also has a metallic bite, Karyne muttered.
Now you're confusing the price of freedom versus the taste. But I think it's safe to say that all these men are willing to pay that high of a price. It's why they're here, even the pirates.
Karyne frowned down at the crew, even though it was Larkos who rankled him. Sometimes I think you take jobs from me just to see how far you can push me when we're out at sea. Larkos snorted.
Only sometimes? We just left. I can turn around if you'd rather go back to planning parties with your sister.
He used his stocky frame to lean on the wheel, and Karyne felt the pull against Starspeed's rudder. I haven't reported you for treason yet, and I listen far more than you might think. Larkos adjusted the wheel back, his beard shifting with his grin.
That's what I'm counting on. Besides, something tells me we're not getting paid this time.
I hope you enjoyed listening to the latest installment of Blood of the Stars by Karyne Norton. If you enjoy listening to this narration, you might also enjoy listening to his audio dramas at spiritblade.com or his podcast, Christian Geek Central, where he discusses movies, video games, and all things enjoyed by self-proclaimed geeks from a Christian worldview. Thanks so much for listening.